Wonderful.
I think you should look for that as a profession.
Oh, nice. Thank you. Welcome to Bellingham Voices. I'm Marie Marchand, and on today's show, I'm very excited to welcome somebody who has a unique, creative, and very broad professional background, and that is Clyde Ford. Welcome to the show, Clyde.
Thanks, Marie. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to be on BTV.
Thank you so much. We're going to start out with a little bit about your background, but first I wanted to give people an idea of the different professions that you've held. So you've been a chiropractor and a therapist.
I have.
Mm-hmm. You've been a teacher of Swahili.
I have.
And a novelist.
Yes.
And the novelist is how many local people know you. And just remind us of the name of your detective.
Charlie Noble. He's a Marine detective, or as he says, he's a fisheye rather than a private eye.
Nice. And it takes place in Bellingham?
Absolutely. Bellingham, the San Juans, the Canadian Gulf Islands, and up along the Inside Passage where I've loved to cruise.
So other things you've done is you identify as a child of the civil rights freedom struggle.
Absolutely.
And then a CEO of a local software company.
Yes, that's my latest incarnation.
Wonderful. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So first, let us know how you ended up in Bellingham, because I know you were born in New York. And I'm curious about how you landed here.
Yeah, well, when I joke with people, I say it's because I took I took I-80 West and then I-5 North. But the truth of it is, while I did do that, years before I drove across country to Bellingham, I'd actually been in chiropractic college in Portland, Oregon. And in the summers, I got a chance to go to Orcas Island to do workshops. And from across Rosario Strait, on the top of Mount Constitution one day, I saw this gem of a city beneath this mountain, and I said to my friends, I don't know what that city is, but boy, I bet you I'd really like to live there. And probably 10 or 15 years later, I got the chance to move here, and it's one of the best moves I've ever made.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's a nice story about just saying, that's beautiful, and I'm going to go there. I don't know what it's called. So
sometimes that's the way your life works out. If you take one step in a direction, even if you're not sure of all the steps that might follow, that first step can be very profound and lead you on a really great adventure.
I want to return to the writing part, because I know that's been an important part of your life. You've written many books, and not only the detective books, but I'm curious what your favorite aspect of the writing process is.
Yeah, well, you know, it's funny. I started the process because when I was in practice as a chiropractor and psychotherapist, I had a patient who himself was a very famous writer, and he would always come in and say to me, you have a story inside of you. You have to tell it. You have a story inside of you. So really one day, just to stop David from continuing to say this to me, I said, okay, David, I'll write. And I had resisted it up to that point because I didn't think I had much to say. And what I discovered is that there is a way of tapping into your creative process that happens as you write that opens up this marvelous opportunity to communicate deeply held thoughts and feelings or to communicate important ideas. And that's what was really exciting to me, is just the opportunity to do that.
Are you working on a book now?
Well, writers are always working on their next book, in their minds at least. And not only have I written books, but also screenplays. And I do have a screenplay that I'm working on right now.
When we talked a few weeks ago, you mentioned a possible book that you'd like to write. So I wanted to have you talk about that because it's super interesting. So it's readers meeting the 20 most influential people in their lives, even if they're famous people. And I'm particularly interested because I've always wanted to meet Bono. So when I was 15, Joshua Tree album came out, and so I went and saw U2 3 times. And then as his maturation evolved, he became involved in Amnesty International, and then he became involved in the One campaign and fighting poverty, trying to end poverty, and then became a diplomat for the United States and for Ireland, where he's from. And so he would sit with world leaders in his interesting glasses and talk about important issues. So if I can glean any way from what you're going to say about me meeting Bono, I would appreciate that.
Oh, that sounds like a great story, and I certainly encourage you to reach out and try to do that. The idea for that book really came from what I did in my life probably 30 or more years ago, where I wrote down on a piece of paper 20 people that I wanted to meet, some of whom were, you know, at least in those days, well known, and I systematically went about figuring out ways to meet them. My only challenge, or my only goal with myself, was that I would not just go to them kind of hat in hand and say, oh, please, I really want to meet you. I had to have something to offer them, however small and insignificant, so that I felt like there was a sharing taking place and not just, as I said, going asking for something. And I was amazed. I got to meet each of those 20 people. Wow. And my life is different because of that, because of how they influenced me, because of the directions they challenged me in, the thoughts that they shared with me, and the sense of what it is that I could do in my life. And what I found about even really famous people is that the most important thing is they like to be approached as just human beings. And that's what I learned from those kinds of encounters. And that's what I always did. And so I did get these really marvelous opportunities to meet famous neuroscientists and to meet people who were very famous in the fields of medicine and healing, to meet famous writers. And again, my choice of who those 20 were. And I encourage people to make similar lists and find ways, particularly in this day of the internet, where you can email people and do all of those other things that you couldn't do 30 years ago. I think the opportunity to reach out and develop your friendship with interesting people is there.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's inspiring.
Yeah, it was to me, for sure.
Thank you. Switching gears, talk about your involvement in the civil rights freedom struggle.
Yes, well, I grew up, believe it or not, it's almost hard for me to imagine, but I grew up in the day of Jim Crow and segregation. Although I grew up in New York City, much of our family was in Virginia, in the Tidewater area of Virginia. And so when we would take summer trips down there, we had to stop at the Mason-Dixon line and change into a bus for blacks only and sit at, if we were not in that bus, then we had to move our seats to the back of the bus. When we got to our family's home, for example, my aunt's home in Newport News, we loved to go swimming as kids in the summer, but there was one pool for black folks and one pool for white folks, and those kinds of segregated rules were strictly enforced. So I grew up understanding the pain of that. I remember my parents being refused the opportunity to be served at a lunch counter on our way driving north from Virginia, and the discussion that happened among my mother and father about whether this was a time for them to resist and protest, or whether that would put us as children and as a family in jeopardy. I remember what it was like to be with a mother who was very adventurous and would take my sister and I on trips throughout the United States. And often, although we would call ahead for motel or hotel reservations, once we got there and they realized that we were African American, all of a sudden that room wouldn't be there anymore. So that was how I grew up as a young child. And as I got older, I realized that the injustices that you see around you, you as a citizen of this nation have the opportunity to do things that might produce change. And so both as a young person in high school and later on and in college after that, I did get involved in ways that I thought I could make a difference. And some of those I'm very proud of. I can look back and say that as a student at Wesleyan University, we were very instrumental, that is the African American students, in protesting and demanding that the university actually contribute a significant amount of money, which became the seed money to start the Martin Luther King Jr. Nonviolence Center in Atlanta, Georgia. And so I was able, about a year after King was killed, to hand Coretta Scott King a check, me and 5 or 6 other students from Wesleyan University. That was the seed money for the MLK Center. So things like that, always have convinced me that you never stand by in the face of things happening that aren't going in a direction that you feel is important. There's always something you can do. You just need to figure out how to do it and then get out and actually try to make a difference.
That's wonderful. I wanted to bring up a connection that you and I have.
Yes.
And that's Dr. Vincent Harding,
Absolutely.
a shared teacher,
Yes.
decades apart. And he was very important to both of us, very
Absolutely.
instrumental.
Yeah.
I knew Dr. Harding. You call him Vincent, and I call him Dr. Harding because that's just how I knew him, at the ILF School of Theology, where he served as professor of social and religious transformation for over 20 years. The first year I was there, he was one of the reasons that I went, if not the reason that I chose to go there. The first year I was there, he was recovering from a stroke. so he wasn't teaching. But the second year I was able to take one class from him, and it was a very profound class because it was a retrospective of his life and work. So we read his books, wrote reflection papers on his books, and then discussed it with the class. It was quite beautiful. And he was also a mentor of mine. So talk a little bit about Dr. Harding, and also talk about Dr. King a little bit.
Sure. Well, as I just listened to you talk about your experience with Vincent, all of my experiences kind of are coming to the surface. And really the story with Vincent starts with us handing Coretta that check to start the Martin Luther King Nonviolence Center, because the first aspect of that center was an institute called the Institute of the Black World. Vincent Harding was the director of the Institute of the Black World, so that check was really used to establish this think tank, really, one of the first African-American think tanks. And the beautiful thing about that is that they invited students to be there, and so I was one of the first 6 students to be part of the Institute of the Black World, and spent almost a year studying directly with Vincent and Lerone Bennett and some of the really brilliant African-American scholars, Joyce Ladner, of that time. So I really appreciated so much the guidance that they gave me as a sometimes angry young man because of the injustices around me, and what it is they helped me do in terms of focusing that anger in positive ways and in very productive ways. Interesting thing that so many people don't know about Vincent is that Vincent was not only a close confidant of Martin King, but he was also Martin's speechwriter for very significant speeches, and probably the most significant speech that Martin gave in terms of his shift and direction was the Beyond Vietnam speech in April 1967 at the Riverside Drive Church in New York. And that was a speech that Vincent actually wrote directly. And then King actually delivered it in this very beautiful way. So Vincent, for me, was a model of scholarship. He was a model of activism. He was a model of somebody willing to change as the society demanded him to change in order to proceed with important issues like reduction of violence against all sorts of groups. Vincent was somebody very deeply rooted in a nonviolent tradition, both with his Mennonite background and his Quaker background. So in many ways, Vincent helped to shape my character. I know he helped to shape your character, and so it was wonderful for us to meet again when we both arrived separately here in Bellingham. And you started by saying that the first year you were at Iliff, Vincent was recovering from a stroke. And I remember that time very well because Vincent called me and asked, could he come out to Bellingham as part of his recovery? And so we were out here for, I think about 2 weeks, and we took walks around Lake Padden, and he really loved it here in Bellingham. He loved the air, he loved nature. It was a very healing place for him. And so it was also just wonderful when in 2008 we could invite Vincent back to Bellingham at the annual Martin Luther King Jr. Day event at City Hall and have him speak to a community that he already knew well, but they didn't know him.
That is what it means to let the hope of the dream go on. And I am happy to see you, and I am happy to go on with you, because each of us has the work to do to carry on the dream. Thank you.
One thing I remember is Dr. Harding talking about a very special time that evening, that night, where he sat in vigil over Dr. King's body. And hearing him talk about that and having Coretta believe that he was the one to be able to do that.
Yeah, that's a very profound moment, and I think it speaks to who Vincent was, both in the history of the freedom struggle and his deep, deep, deep commitment to King's belief in nonviolence, but also to the type of man he was, that Coretta would look to him as the person to stand vigil because of Vincent's very deep spiritual roots and his very deep sense of how to bring forward the ideas and actions that King stood for in his life, personally and in the lives of students and those around him. Vincent could do that. Vincent could draw out of you, as I know he did with you, a belief that you can make a difference and you can do it nonviolently and you can produce change that way. And so I think Coretta understood that. Everybody around Vincent understood that. When you stood in his presence, you felt something. There was this quiet sense of strength. Vincent wasn't very talkative often, but you knew there was something behind his silence that was very powerful and very motivating.
Thank you for that. You're also well known in our community for being the MC and help organizing the Martin Luther King Jr. event each year. It's got a long history, and just briefly, can you mention about that history and your role in it?
Sure, I'd be glad to, and I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say that I've recently been dubbed the MLK guy. There was somebody in the food co-op who saw me and realized I was involved in the event and kept pointing at me and saying, MLK guy, MLK guy. So my friends have started to call me that. About 26 years ago, when I first moved here, I realized that the nation celebrated Martin Luther King Jr. Day, the state celebrated Martin Luther King Jr. Day, the county celebrated Martin Luther King Jr. Day, the university did, but the city of Bellingham didn't. So then president of the local chapter of the NAACP, Renee Collins, and I walked into Mayor Tim Douglas's office and said, Tim, we have to change this. And so we worked with Tim, we worked with the city council in those days, we worked with community members, and we did get a decree saying that from city council, who basically recognized Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and that then became an official holiday of the city of Bellingham. And along with that, we really were looking forward to a way of honoring it beyond just that proclamation. And so that was the event that took place, and we were proud that the city would allow us to use City Hall, which we always looked at as the People's Hall, and to hold our event. And I've been involved, sometimes not always available because of either travel schedule or other commitments, but I've been fairly involved with that event in the 26 years since. Yeah.
It was very fun on January 16th. We had some amazing speakers, some women speakers who were incredible.
And that's what we've always tried to do. We've tried to highlight who in this community, first we've tried to highlight the diversity of this community, the diverse viewpoints of this community, and the issues that are important to people in this community that need addressing and that need to change. And so this year was no different. We had a young Muslim woman, and she was able to express her concerns and her fears. We had a young undocumented woman, Vicky Meti, and she was there and followed up really very shortly by an important meeting at City Council to address some of the issues that are really important for her in terms of Bellingham becoming a sanctuary city. So we've looked at that Martin Luther King Jr. Day as a moment from which people could take a springboard to action and actually do things coming out of that day. Now, I'll just give you a really good example. So this year we had a young Muslim woman, Nina Ahmed, and afterwards the Bellingham, the Whatcom County Islamic Society, invited a group of us to come by the mosque in order to see what they're doing, to listen to one of their sermons, and to be with them at their 12 noon prayer. So a week or so from today, a group of us are going to take them up on that offer and really reach out to our Muslim community members and neighbors and friends in this show of support and solidarity at a time when they're feeling a lot of stress as being identified in very negative ways and in a very negative light in this society.
As we kind of close our time together,
Sure.
I'm hoping that you can talk about how the historic struggle relates to the struggle now in terms of racial justice and seeking freedom. In particular, we know that there's an epidemic of people of color being killed by police. Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, and we are seeing people dying because of technology, because of Facebook, people's wives and girlfriends filming it, and then we watch it, people get shot, which brings it home to our hearts that this is a problem, that it's not only the people I named, but it's pages and pages of names of people. And During the MLK event, you were talking about Black Lives Matter and how it connects to the historic struggle. And in particular, you were talking about a sign that African American men wore in the 1950s and 60s that said simply, "I am a man," to draw attention to the injustices that were happening, but also to affirm that Black Lives Matter. So talk about some of the similarities and some of the differences between those movements.
Well, it's interesting because this really goes back to Vincent Harding. And Vincent, as a premier African historian, always would tell us when, we young people who really wanted change to happen, he would always say, first, look back at the history and understand where it is we've come from that brings us to this point. So yes, you're absolutely right. We see so much in terms of, excessive use of force and what happens to, let's say, African American young men and women at the wrong end of law enforcement. And that I would also be remiss if I didn't say that not all law enforcement is like this, but in those incidents where that happens. And yet, I think in some ways what is missed is that this has been going on for a long time. Mm-hmm. This is not new. The technology that films it is new, and thank God for that technology because it does bring it home in a certain important way that we haven't been able to see it. So there is a history. I mean, there is unfortunate history in this country of violence against people of color that goes right back to the founding of this country, and yet now it is no longer in the closet. And now it's come out more. And I think that's a challenge to everybody. It's a challenge to find ways to address that and to change that. And that, for me, is where the real issues are. What do you do in this day and age, in this day of technology, that might really help folks find tools and find means that would make a difference, that would reduce violence against minorities and marginalized groups and people of color, that would prevent excessive use of force, that would do something to help against the hate crimes that we see now on a rise in this country. Mm-hmm. Those, to me, are really, really important issues. I do think there are solutions to them. And I think that's what we need to pursue. What are some of the means that we can use with a deep understanding of the historical context that they happen? Mm-hmm. What type of change can we bring about? Mm-hmm. I'm on my way, for example, to a conference right after this interview, which is to address this very issue. I mean, what do we do in this day and age, particularly using technology, that might make a difference to help marginalized groups in this time when they're feeling, rightly so, beset by some of the challenges around them. Mm-hmm.
Is this something that you do with your new software company?
Well, my new software company does a number of things. Our core business is in public safety, so ambulance, fire, police, things of that nature, we certainly address there. But I always wanted us to find a way to use technology so that it would benefit the least welcomed among us, and so it would benefit often those people who are marginalized. And what I like to say is we try to put the public back in public safety. And by that I mean we've developed some technologies that we're using on Native American nations, on college campuses to fight human trafficking and to help marginalized groups really address some of the issues that they're beset with. So yes, it's part of what we do. It's part of my commitment in understanding and working with technology for as long as I have actually, that there ought to be something we can do with current technology put in the hands of people who really need to have tools to help them address the issues that they're faced with.
Right now, as we close the last question, I wanted to totally switch gears.
Sure.
Okay, so I make a mental shift here. And I want to end with something fun. And I've known you for a decade, but I just learned this yesterday. And so this is when you were on Oprah.
Oh my gosh.
And I wanted to find out, first of all, how that came about. And then second, what was it like?
Well, it's a really funny story because I had just finished a book called We Can All Get Along, 50 Steps You Can Take to Help End Racism. It was published by Bantam Doubleday Dale. And my PR person said, well, she wanted some input as to how we could market this book and get people to know about it. So I said, well, let's get on Oprah. And she said, yeah, that's right. She kind of looked at me like, you're really crazy. I said, well, at least let's try. And so we sent the book by FedEx to Oprah, and it just happened to be delivered on the day when Oprah was having a staff meeting about what they were going to do for Martin Luther King Jr. Day. She wanted to do something significant. This would have been 1994. The book was dropped on the table, as her producers told me. Oprah looked at the book and said, that's what we're going to do. And what was really gratifying about that, of course, being on the Oprah show is really fun, and it's a lot of notoriety. And even locally, the Bellingham Herald got to write up local guy gets on Oprah. But what was most important for me was that Oprah took the ideas in that book seriously and got a group of people, about 20 people, to commit for at least a week or more to follow some of the steps in that book, like visiting a service from a faith different from yours, like celebrating a holiday from a tradition different from yours, like reaching out to a person of a different ethnic or racial background. So when we got to the discussion, there were people who had actually read my book, which is always amazing for an author, but more than that, had taken seriously some of the ideas. So it was an interesting discussion with those folks. And then I think we also talked about how strange it was in some ways that Oprah often liked to have conflict on her show. So she had invited on the show supposedly a group of white nationalist racists who were going to sit across from me, and we were supposed to have this discussion. Well, it turns out that the folks she invited were actually tax resistors. And so in the middle of the show, she turned to them and said, I thought you folks were white nationalists, and all you're here to do is talk about anti-tax stuff. So it was an interesting program in terms of some of the levity and the funny moments. And I think one of the moments I remember most is we had a very serious discussion about what we could do to help people really come together as a country. And there was a woman who stood up so excited that she grabbed the microphone out of Oprah's hands. Oprah turned to her and said, girl, give me that microphone. And there was this interesting discussion that happened in the audience with Oprah around that. So for me, it was one of the times I had a chance to be on national TV, but more importantly, it was a time that I got to talk about and be with people who were taking seriously the idea that as a society, we could do things that would help us work with people who are different, that would reduce hate, that would reduce violence, that would support love, that would support inclusion and tolerance for all folks who we live with. And that was what was both heartwarming and really wonderful for me. And then a nice aspect of that many people never heard about is I lived out in the county towards Linden at the time, and a group of neighbors who knew I was going to get on the Oprah show did things like knit sweaters and scarves for Oprah. And so I got to carry with me a package of presents from Whatcom County to give to her, and I thought was a very nice expression of what was really in the hearts, certainly of my neighbors, and what I know is in the hearts of so many people here in this wonderful county that we live in.
That's just a gem of a story.
Thanks.
Oh, wow. It's been great talking with you today, having this conversation and remembering Dr. Harding and just learning about your background. So thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you, Marie. I'm glad you're doing this. I look forward to coming back someday in the future as well, too.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today for Bellingham Voices, and we will see you next time.